The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered face of Luke Carter as he studied the crumpled parchment in his trembling hands. 40 years of prospecting had left deep creases around his eyes and a permanent stoop to his shoulders, but the map he'd discovered in that dead Apache warrior's pouch had awakened something in him he thought long buried. Hope. The legendary lost Padre mine had claimed more lives than any strike in the Arizona territory, yet here was its secret laid bare in faded ink and careful symbols. In his small cabin on the outskirts of Tucson, Luke traced the route with a calloused finger, ignoring the ache in his joints as he leaned over the rough-hewn table. The path led through the heart of Apache territory, crossing treacherous mountain passes and sun-scorched valleys. But the promise of gold wasn't what drove him. It was the chance to finally discover what happened to his brother Nathan all those years ago when he'd vanished searching for this same mine. A knock at his door startled Luke from his contemplation. Standing in the doorway was Father Joshua Lopez, his usually pristine black cassock covered in trail dust. The young priest's face bore the haunted look Luke had seen too often in these parts. The expression of a man who'd witnessed things that had shaken his very soul. Without waiting for an invitation, Joshua stepped inside, his boots leaving dusty prints on the wooden floor. "I heard rumors in town," Joshua said, his voice hoarse. "They say you found something in the mountains, something that belongs to the Apache." His dark eyes fixed on the map, and Luke instinctively moved to cover it. But there was something in the priest's desperate expression that gave him pause. Here was a man as lost as the mine itself, seeking not gold, but redemption. Before Luke could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway, Eleanor Hall, known throughout Tucson's saloons as Desert Rose. Her fine dress was at odds with the determined set of her jaw, and the small derringer visible in her reticule spoke of a woman who'd learned to survive in a harsh land. "If you're planning what I think you are, Mr. Carter, you'll need someone who knows these mountains better than just what's drawn on that paper." Luke had crossed paths with Eleanor before, back when she first arrived in Tucson with dreams of opening her own establishment. She'd been forced to take up work at the Redbird Saloon instead, but her quick wit and sharper aim had earned her a reputation as someone who could handle herself in trouble. Now she stood in his doorway, offering help he hadn't asked for but desperately needed. The situation grew more complicated with the arrival of Isaac Nelson, a freed slave who'd made his way west after the war. His powerful frame filled the doorway as he stepped inside, and Luke noticed the fresh rope burns around his wrists, evidence that not everyone in Tucson accepted a free black man. "Overheard some men in town planning to take that map from you tonight," Isaac said quietly. "Thought you should know." Luke's mind raced as he looked at the unlikely group gathered in his cabin. The Apache would be tracking him already, knowing he'd taken something sacred from their fallen warrior. The mine's location had been their secret for generations, and they'd kill to keep it that way. But with winter approaching and his brother's memory haunting his dreams, Luke knew this might be his last chance to uncover the truth. The map showed a route through the Dragoon Mountains, following ancient trails that would be nearly impossible to spot without a guide. Eleanor's knowledge of the terrain would be invaluable, and Isaac's strength could mean the difference between life and death in the rugged country ahead. As for Father Lopez, the man clearly carried burdens that went beyond his calling, burdens that might be lightened by helping others find their way. "We leave at first light," Luke announced, rolling up the map with decisive movements. "Pack light, bring weapons, and be ready to ride hard. The Apache won't be our only concern. Every cutthroat and claim jumper between here and Durango will be on our trail once word gets out." He met each of their eyes in turn, seeing determination mixed with fear, hope tangled with desperation. The night passed in a flurry of preparation. Luke cleaned his old Spencer carbine and counted out ammunition, while Eleanor gathered supplies from her contacts in town. Isaac disappeared into the darkness, returning hours later with 4 of the finest horses Luke had seen in years. He didn't ask where they came from. Father Lopez spent the night in prayer, though Luke noticed he also checked and loaded a Colt revolver with practiced hands. As dawn broke over the Sonoran Desert, the small party gathered at the edge of town. The morning air was crisp, carrying the promise of autumn and the threat of early snow in the high country. Luke took one last look at Tucson, knowing that if they survived this journey, nothing would ever be the same. The weight of the map pressed against his chest where he'd hidden it in an oilskin pouch, along with the few clues he had about Nathan's disappearance. The first rays of sunlight caught the silver cross hanging from Father Lopez's neck as he mounted his horse. Eleanor adjusted her split riding skirt and checked the rifle scabbard attached to her saddle. Isaac sat his mount with the easy grace of a natural horseman, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. They were an unlikely crew for such a desperate venture, but Luke had learned long ago that destiny often worked through strange companions. Luke urged his horse forward, leading the group onto the narrow trail that wound through the saguaro-studded foothills. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain, and the distant mountains loomed like dark sentinels against the pale sky. His weathered hands gripped the reins tightly as memories of Nathan's last letter flooded back, cryptic warnings about Apache scouts and whispers of gold that had driven good men mad. Eleanor rode close behind, the rhythmic creaking of her saddle leather punctuating the morning quiet. She'd traded her usual finery for practical canvas and leather, but there was still an unmistakable grace in how she carried herself. Luke had initially hesitated to accept her offer of help, but her knowledge of the local tribes and skill with a rifle had proven invaluable during their preparation. Father Lopez muttered what might have been prayers in Spanish, though his eyes remained fixed on the treacherous path ahead. The massacre at the mission had left him a changed man, his once steady faith replaced by a haunted look that spoke of horrors witnessed and sins unforgiven. Yet he knew these mountains better than anyone, having spent years ministering to the scattered mining camps before the darkness fell. Isaac rode point, reading the land with the keen eye of someone who'd spent years evading pursuit. His freedom had come at a terrible price, and the scars on his back told a story of suffering that needed no words. But it was his tracking skills that had helped Luke piece together Nathan's last known route, following traces that others had missed. As they climbed higher into the foothills, Luke spotted the first signs of trouble. Fresh horse tracks crossing their path, heading north toward Apache territory. He raised his hand, signaling the others to halt, while Isaac dismounted to examine the tracks. The escaped slave's expression grew grave as he traced the impressions in the dusty earth. 6 riders, Isaac said quietly, moving fast, probably armed. Passed through here no more than 2 hours ago. He pointed to distinctive markings in the dirt. One of them's riding a horse with a split shoe. Same tracks I found near Nathan's last camp. Eleanor's hand moved to her rifle, her face hardening with determination. Caleb's men, she said, spitting the name like poison. He always did prefer that blacksmith in Durango, the one who couldn't nail a shoe properly to save his life. The mention of Caleb brought a chill to the morning air. The man's reputation for violence was well earned. Father Lopez crossed himself, a habit that seemed more reflex than faith these days. If they're heading to the high country, they must know something. The old mine workings are up there, abandoned when the Apache raids began. Nathan must have found something in those ruins worth dying for. Luke felt the weight of the map grow heavier against his chest. Nathan's last message had mentioned ancient Spanish workings, tunnels that predated the American mines. But it wasn't just gold his brother had been pursuing. There were darker secrets buried in those mountains, truths that powerful men would kill to keep hidden. The small party gathered closer, their horses sensing the tension and shifting nervously. Luke studied the faces of his companions. A fallen priest, a woman seeking redemption, a man who'd never known freedom until now. They were all carrying their own burdens, their own reasons for following this dangerous path. But it was the shared weight of secrets and the promise of justice that bound them together. "We'll need to change our route," Luke announced, pulling out the worn map. "There's an old Apache trail that cuts through the high passes. It's treacherous, but it might give us a chance to get ahead of them." Niuam. He traced the faint line with his finger, remembering Nathan's stories about the hidden paths that wound through these mountains like ancient serpents. Eleanor leaned forward in her saddle, her eyes sharp. The tribes consider those paths sacred. Crossing them without permission is asking for war. She glanced at Father Lopez. "Unless you still have some influence with the local chiefs?" The priest's bitter laugh held no mirth. "The only influence I have left is with the dead, señorita. And there are plenty of those in these mountains." He adjusted the revolver at his hip, a gesture that seemed to contradict his collar. "But perhaps that's fitting. We're all walking with ghosts now." The mountain winds whipped mercilessly across Luke Carter's weathered face as he led his unlikely band of travelers deeper into Apache territory. The old prospector's arthritic fingers clutched the mysterious map he'd won in a high-stakes poker game in Durango, its worn edges threatening to tear with each gust. Behind him rode Eleanor Hall, the former saloon girl whose dreams stretched far beyond the cramped confines of her previous life. Her red dress replaced with practical riding clothes that couldn't quite disguise her natural grace. Nathan Lopez, the escaped slave whose scarred back told stories of unimaginable cruelty, rode third in their line. His eyes constantly scanned the rocky outcrops above, knowing that freedom meant nothing if an Apache arrow found its mark. Last came Father Isaac Allen, his collar long discarded, but the weight of his lost faith still heavy on his shoulders. The priest hadn't uttered a prayer since witnessing the Tucson massacre, but his hand still instinctively reached for the cross that no longer hung around his neck. The group had left Durango 3 days ago, after Luke revealed the map's existence to his carefully chosen companions. Each had their own reasons for joining this foolhardy quest. Eleanor needed the gold to start a new life in San Francisco. Nathan sought enough wealth to ensure no one could ever own him again. And Isaac, well, the priest claimed he was searching for redemption, though Luke suspected he was really looking for a way to end his pain. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as they ascended, their horses picking their way carefully through narrow passes where one misstep meant certain death. Luke found himself thinking of Joshua Hall, Eleanor's brother, who'd died defending a mining claim from claim jumpers 2 years ago. The story she'd shared around the campfire their first night out had struck a chord. Luke had lost his own family to mining disputes, though he kept those details to himself. A flash of movement caught Nathan's eye, and he signaled the group to halt. High above, a lone figure stood watching them. Not Apache, but a white man in a threadbare duster. "That's Caleb Nelson," Eleanor whispered, her voice tight with recognition. "He was in Tucson during the massacre. Some say he helped lead the raiders." Isaac's hands clenched his reins so tight his knuckles went white, and Luke knew their journey had just become infinitely more complicated. The narrow trail forced them to continue single file, but now tension crackled through the group like summer lightning. Luke had heard of Caleb Nelson, a former cavalry officer turned mercenary who developed a reputation for doing anything for the right price. If he was here, others would be close by. The old prospector began to wonder if the map's previous owner had lost more than just a poker game that night in Durango. As the sun began to set, they made camp in a sheltered box canyon. Eleanor tended to the horses while Nathan gathered firewood, his movements deliberately slow and careful to avoid drawing attention. Isaac sat apart from the others, turning something over and over in his hands. When Luke approached, he saw it was a silver medallion, Saint Christopher, patron saint of travelers. "Found it in the massacre debris," the priest said softly. "Been carrying it ever since, though I'm not sure why anymore." That night, as the others slept, Luke studied the map by moonlight. The markings suggested the legendary Apache mine lay another 2 days' ride ahead, but something about the route troubled him. The trail led through Devil's Canyon, a natural bottleneck where ambush would be all too easy. He'd lost too many friends to ambushes over the years to ignore his instincts now, but the alternative route would add days to their journey through even more dangerous territory. Morning brought no clarity, only the discovery that someone had gone through their saddlebags while they slept. Nothing was taken, but Luke found a playing card, the ace of spades, tucked into his map case. Eleanor recognized it immediately. "That's from the Durango Saloon deck. Whoever left this wants us to know they were there that night." Nathan's hand went to the rifle at his side, while Isaac simply stared at the card as if it held all the answers they sought. The group pressed on, but now every shadow held potential threats. Every rustle of wind through the rocks might be footsteps. Luke found himself watching his companions more closely, wondering if any of them knew more than they were sharing. Eleanor's story about her brother seemed genuine, but there was something in the way she looked at the mountains that suggested familiarity. Nathan's vigilance could be explained by his past, but sometimes his eyes lingered too long on certain landmarks. And Isaac? The priest's silence spoke volumes. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the narrow mountain pass as they picked their way between towering walls of red rock. Luke noticed Eleanor repeatedly consulting her own worn journal, making notes and comparing them to something she wouldn't share. When he finally confronted her about it during their evening camp, she reluctantly revealed a series of letters from her brother, containing cryptic references to landmarks along their route. "He wasn't just looking for gold," she explained, her voice tight with emotion. He was tracking something else. Or someone. Nathan tensed at her words, his scarred hands gripping his rifle stock. Your brother wouldn't happen to have mentioned a man named Joshua Bradley, would he? The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was answer enough. Isaac looked up from his evening prayers for the first time in hours, his eyes suddenly alert. The name clearly meant something to all of them, though none seemed willing to share exactly what. The next morning brought them to a decrepit mining camp, its weathered structures listing like broken teeth against the mountainside. Luke recognized the setup. Chinese laborers had worked this claim, evident from the distinctive construction style and fragments of rice bowls scattered among the ruins. But something darker had happened here. The building showed signs of violence. Old bloodstains had turned the wood black in places, and bullet holes pockmarked the walls in telling patterns. Isaac moved through the camp like a man in a trance, touching the walls with trembling fingers. I know this place, he whispered. 3 years ago, I gave last rites to 17 souls here. They said it was Apache raiders, but the killing was too methodical. He turned to face the others, his face ashen. This was Joshua Bradley's work. He and his men used the Apache as cover for their own brutality. I kept quiet then. God help me. But I've carried the weight of that silence ever since. Eleanor's hands shook as she pulled more letters from her saddlebag. My brother discovered Bradley's operation, how he used the chaos of tribal conflicts to mask his own attacks on mining camps. He was gathering evidence, building a case. Her voice cracked. The last letter came from near here, then nothing. Luke watched as Nathan's expression hardened, recognizing the look of a man whose past had finally caught up with him. The wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing through the ruined camp. Luke found himself studying a section of wall where someone had carved a series of numbers. At first glance, they appeared random, but Eleanor's sharp intake of breath suggested otherwise. Those are coordinates, she said, quickly copying them into her journal. My brother used this system. It's how we communicated when he was surveying for the railroad. Her fingers traced the rough markings. These are fresh, no more than a week old. Nathan's tracking skills confirmed her assessment, revealing more. Multiple sets of boot prints, spent cartridges that still smelled of powder, and signs that horses had been tied nearby recently. Bradley's men are ahead of us, he concluded grimly. They're following the same trail, probably using your brother's maps. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Were they pursuing the Apache mine's gold, or were they eliminating anyone who knew too much about their operations? As dusk approached, they made camp in a sheltered hollow, away from the old mining site. Luke noticed how Isaac had stopped pretending to pray, instead cleaning his old Colt with mechanical precision. Eleanor pored over her brother's letters by firelight, matching them against the new coordinates. Nathan kept watch, his posture suggesting he expected trouble sooner rather than later. The Ace of Spades from Durango seemed to take on new meaning, not just a warning, but a declaration of intent. The night grew colder as they huddled around the small fire, each lost in their own thoughts. Luke realized their quest had shifted. The legendary Apache mine was still their destination, but now it seemed more like a piece in a larger, deadlier game. The gold they sought might prove to be less valuable than the truth they were uncovering, and far more dangerous to unearth. In the distance, a coyote's lonely howl echoed off the canyon walls, a sound too similar to human laughter for comfort. The morning brought no relief from their unease. As they broke camp, Eleanor discovered fresh tracks in the loose shale. Someone had watched them during the night. Nathan examined the prints, his weathered face creasing with concern. 3 men, maybe 4. They're shadowing us, staying just out of sight. Luke's hand instinctively moved to his rifle, while Isaac remained unnaturally still, his eyes scanning the ridgeline above. Eleanor spread her brother's letters across a flat rock, the yellowed pages fluttering in the mountain breeze. There's something here we're missing, she muttered, tracing the spidery handwriting with a finger. The coordinates lead to the Apache mine, yes, but these references to Caroline's burden keep appearing. Luke noticed how Isaac flinched at the name, though the priest said nothing, just continued staring at the distant peaks as if seeking absolution in their ancient faces. They pushed deeper into the mountains, following a narrow trail that wound between towering walls of rust-colored stone. The air grew thinner, making their horses labor with each step. The high mountain pass echoed with gunfire as Luke Carter's group took cover behind a cluster of boulders. The aging prospector's weathered hands trembled slightly as he reloaded his Winchester, the precious map to the Apache mine tucked safely in his breast pocket. Beside him, Nathan Hall, the former slave whose scarred back told stories of brutal plantation life, peered around the rocks to spot their attackers. Not Apache warriors as they'd feared, but a ruthless gang of claim jumpers who'd been trailing them since Durango. Eleanor Lopez crouched low, her once fine dress now trail-worn and dusty. She'd left her brothel days behind, dreaming of striking it rich, but now wondered if she'd survive to see those dreams realized. The woman's quick wit had already saved them twice on this journey, and her steady aim with a derringer had earned the others' respect. She exchanged a knowing look with Father Isaac Allen, whose collar seemed to weigh heavier with each passing day. "They're trying to flank us," Nathan's urgent whisper cut through the thin mountain air. The ex-slave had developed an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and predict enemy movements during his years on the run. Luke knew they were running out of options. The narrow pass offered little room for maneuver, and the sacred Apache burial grounds lay just beyond. They'd promised to avoid that hallowed space, but now it seemed their only escape route. Father Isaac clutched his rosary, the beads clicking softly against each other. The massacre at Pueblo still haunted his dreams. Innocent families gunned down while he could only watch and pray. But today, his prayers had been replaced by the cold steel of a Colt revolver. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," he muttered, drawing a surprised glance from Eleanor. The priest's transformation from man of peace to hardened survivor mirrored their own desperate journey. A bullet sparked off the rocks inches from Luke's head, sending stone fragments flying. The prospector's mind raced through their options, the map's cryptic markings dancing before his eyes. The claim jumpers were led by Joshua Nelson, a former mining engineer whose greed had turned him into a killer. Luke had witnessed Nelson's handiwork firsthand in the charred ruins of a competitor's camp near Tucson. Nathan's voice cut through Luke's thoughts. "There's a cave entrance, about 50 yards up. Natural chimney might lead to the high ground." The former slave's knowledge of hidden paths and escape routes had become invaluable. Eleanor checked her ammunition, 3 shells left in the derringer, 2 in her deceased husband's revolver. They'd have to make every shot count during the dash to safety. Father Isaac's eyes narrowed as he studied the rocky terrain. The Apache believe these mountains house spirits of their ancestors. Perhaps they'll grant us safe passage. His words carried a bitter edge. The priest's crisis of faith had deepened with each life taken during their journey. Yet something in the ancient graves ahead called to him, promising if not redemption, then at least understanding. Luke made his decision as another volley of gunfire peppered their position. "Nathan, you and Eleanor go first. Isaac and I will provide covering fire." He pulled the map from his pocket, studying it one last time before passing it to Eleanor. "If anything happens to me, the mine's location is marked in code. Only someone who knows the old prospector's cipher can read it." Eleanor's hands shook as she took the map. Remembering the cipher Luke had taught her during long evenings around the campfire, she'd left Wichita determined to escape her past, but found herself part of something far larger. A quest that had bound 4 unlikely souls together in ways she never imagined. The brothel madam had become a trusted confidant, her business acumen as valuable as any shooting skill. Nathan touched the medicine pouch given to him by an Apache medicine man they'd helped weeks earlier. The old healer had seen past Nathan's color to recognize a kindred spirit, someone who understood the Earth's secrets. "The spirits guard this place," Nathan said softly. "Nelson's men won't follow us across the burial ground. They know the legends too well." A metallic glint caught Luke's eye. One of Nelson's men had exposed himself while shifting position. The prospector's shot rang out, followed by a cry and the sound of a body tumbling down scree. Luke had never wanted to kill again after the war, but fate had other plans. Each death weighed on him, yet he knew Nelson's gang would show no mercy if they claimed the map. Eleanor and Nathan made their break for the cave, dust and bullets flying around them. Father Isaac's revolver barked repeatedly, his aim deadly accurate despite his trembling hands. The priest's crisis of faith hadn't affected his ability to fight. If anything, it had made him more determined to protect his companions, the only family he had left in this harsh world. The cave's entrance beckoned like salvation's mouth, promising shelter from the storm of lead. But as Nathan reached the opening, a shot rang out from an unseen position. Eleanor cried out as crimson bloomed across Nathan's shirt. The former slave stumbled, caught himself against the rock face, and somehow kept moving through sheer force of will. Eleanor grabbed his arm, her strength surprising as she pulled him to safety. Inside the cave, Luke pressed a bandana against Nathan's wound while Eleanor kept watch at the entrance. Blood seeped through the fabric, but Nathan's eyes remained focused and determined. "We didn't come this far to die in some hole," he whispered through gritted teeth. The cave's cool dampness provided temporary refuge, but they all knew Nelson's gang wouldn't give up easily, not with the legendary Apache mine's riches at stake. Father Isaac slipped deeper into the cavern, his weathered fingers tracing ancient markings on the wall. The flickering light from Eleanor's lantern revealed what appeared to be crude maps etched into the stone. "These markings," he murmured. "They're not Apache, they're Spanish, from the conquistadors." His theological training had included study of early Spanish settlements, and now that forgotten knowledge might save their lives. Luke studied the crude map they'd been following, comparing it to the cave drawings. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt. They'd been reading it wrong all along. The true entrance to the mine wasn't where they thought. It was accessible only through an underground passage that connected to this very cave system. The Apache had hidden their sacred site beneath the mountain itself, protecting it from greedy European eyes. Eleanor tended to Nathan's wound with gentle hands that belied her former profession. The bullet had passed clean through his shoulder, missing anything vital. "You're lucky," she said softly, "but we need to get you proper care soon." Nathan managed a weak smile, remembering how far they'd all come from their first meeting in that dusty saloon in Durango, where a chance encounter had set them on this deadly path. The sound of falling rocks outside made them freeze. Nelson's men were trying to smoke them out, but they didn't realize they were giving the group exactly what they needed, a distraction. Luke motioned them toward the deeper tunnel, his voice barely above a whisper. The Apache knew these mountains better than anyone. They'd never leave themselves without an escape route. Father Isaac led the way, his crisis of faith temporarily forgotten as he translated more markings. The tunnel twisted downward, the air growing thicker with each step. Eleanor supported Nathan, while Luke brought up the rear, his Winchester ready. The sounds of their pursuers grew fainter as they descended into the mountain's heart. The passage opened into a vast chamber that took their breath away. Shafts of sunlight pierced through hidden openings high above, illuminating veins of gold that sparkled like fallen stars in the rock walls. But it wasn't just a mine. It was a sacred space. Ancient pottery and ceremonial items lined natural stone shelves, undisturbed for centuries. Nathan's voice was filled with awe despite his pain. "This isn't just about the gold anymore. This place, it's history itself." The former slave understood better than most the importance of preserving a people's heritage. Luke nodded, remembering the stories his grandfather had told him about the Apache's deep connection to the land. The moment of reverence was shattered by gunfire echoing through the tunnels. Nelson's men had found the passage. Father Isaac's hands steadied as he reloaded his revolver, a new purpose filling his eyes. "Some things are worth fighting for," he said, "even if they're not what we originally sought." Eleanor discovered a narrow crevice behind a fallen boulder, another exit, just as Luke had predicted. But they faced an impossible choice: escape with their lives, or stay and protect this sacred place from being plundered. The sound of approaching footsteps forced their hand. Luke pulled out sticks of dynamite he'd been saving for mining. "Sometimes," he said grimly, "the only way to protect something is to make sure nobody can have it." They worked quickly, setting charges at key points while the voices grew closer. Nathan, despite his wound, helped place the explosives with precision learned from years of mining work. The ancient chamber seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if these outsiders would prove worthy of its secrets. Just as the first of Nelson's men appeared in the tunnel entrance, Luke lit the fuses. The group fled through the hidden exit, the mountain itself seeming to guide them to safety. Behind them, the explosions rang out like thunder, sealing the sacred chamber forever. The Apache mine would keep its secrets, and perhaps that had been the true purpose of their journey all along. As they emerged into the sunlight on the mountain's far side, each of them was changed. Father Isaac had found something worth believing in again, even if it wasn't what he'd expected. Eleanor's dreams of wealth had been replaced by something more valuable: genuine friendship and purpose. Nathan's quest for freedom had led him to become a protector of others' heritage. And Luke, the aging prospector who'd started it all, realized that the real treasure had been the redemption they'd found along the way. The morning sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of crimson as Luke Allen watched the Apache warriors drag Nathan Hall and Caroline Lopez from the mine entrance. His hands trembled on his Winchester, knowing he couldn't take on 24 braves alone. After weeks of searching, they'd finally found the legendary mine, only to walk straight into an ambush. Father Isaac Carter lay dead 50 yards back, his prayers silenced by an arrow through the throat. The old prospector's map had led them true, but at a terrible cost. Charlotte Nelson crouched beside Luke behind the boulder, her once fine dress now torn and dirt-stained. "We can't just let them die," she whispered. The former saloon girl's eyes fixed on Caroline, the freed slave who'd become like a sister during their harrowing journey. Luke knew Charlotte was right, but charging in would only get them killed too. He thought of how far they'd come since that night in Durango, when Nathan had first shown him the mysterious map. The sound of horses approaching drew Luke's attention. Through the morning haze, he spotted a familiar figure leading a band of riders: Joshua Lopez, Caroline's brother, who'd been tracking them since Tucson. The Apache warriors turned at the commotion, momentarily distracted from their captives. Luke realized this might be their only chance. He caught Charlotte's eye and nodded toward the eastern slope, where loose scree offered cover for a flanking move. As Joshua's men engaged the Apache from the south, Luke and Charlotte worked their way around the battlefield, the air filled with gunfire and war cries. Through his scope, Luke spotted Nathan working free of his bonds while the warriors were occupied. Caroline had managed to slip behind a stack of mining timbers, but she was still in grave danger as arrows and bullets crisscrossed the clearing. Luke's thoughts drifted to Father Isaac's last words about redemption, coming in unexpected forms. The priest had lost his faith after witnessing his congregation massacred, yet in his final moments he'd found peace protecting others. Now Luke understood. Sometimes salvation meant making impossible choices. He steadied his rifle and began picking off warriors one by one, giving Nathan and Caroline a fighting chance. Charlotte proved her worth yet again, using skills learned in countless saloon brawls to move like a ghost through the chaos. She reached Caroline first, passing her a knife before darting toward Nathan. Luke provided covering fire as Joshua's men pushed forward, the morning air growing thick with gunsmoke. The tide was turning, but victory would extract its pound of flesh. In the end, they held the mine, but at a devastating cost. Joshua was dead, along with half his men. Nathan had taken a bullet in the shoulder that would trouble him the rest of his days. Caroline wept over her brother's body while Charlotte bound Nathan's wound. The legendary Apache gold lay within their grasp, but none of them felt much like celebrating. Luke stared at the blood-soaked ground and wondered if any treasure was worth such a price. As the sun climbed higher, they buried their dead in rocky graves overlooking the valley. Caroline spoke quietly in Spanish, offering prayers for Joshua's soul. Charlotte held her hand while Nathan etched crude markers with his good arm. Luke stood apart, Father Isaac's wooden cross heavy in his pocket. The old prospector's map had brought them here, but the real treasure wasn't gold. It was the family they'd forged in blood and sacrifice. Days later, as they loaded the last of the gold onto their pack horses, Luke made a decision. He divided the treasure 5 ways: shares for himself, Nathan, Caroline, and Charlotte, with the 5th portion going to build a school for Apache children. Father Isaac would have approved, Luke thought. Sometimes redemption meant turning blood money into something good. They rode out as the sun set, leaving the legendary mine to fade back into myth. The journey changed them all. Caroline used her share to help other escaped slaves find freedom. Charlotte opened a legitimate business in Pueblo, proving she was more than her past. Nathan's wounds healed, though he never quite regained full use of his arm. And Luke? He found peace in simple prospecting, knowing that true riches couldn't be measured in gold. The Apache mine became a story told in whispers, its location lost again to time and the vastness of the frontier. Years later, Luke would sometimes dream of that blood-soaked morning. He'd wake reaching for his rifle, then remember he was safe in his cabin near Durango. The map that started it all hung framed on his wall, A reminder that the greatest journeys aren't about the destination but the souls we meet along the way. Father Isaac had been right. Redemption comes in unexpected forms, and sometimes the most valuable treasures are the ones that can't be measured in gold dust and nuggets. In the spring of 1875, Luke received an unexpected letter from Charlotte in Pueblo. She'd heard whispers of Caleb's gang resurfacing near the old mining territories, stirring up trouble among the settlements. Though Luke had made peace with the past, the news awakened something in him. Not vengeance, but a responsibility to ensure their shared sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Caroline had established a successful way station for the Underground Railroad in Wichita, helping countless souls find their way north. When Luke's message reached her about the gathering storm, she knew she couldn't ignore it. The scars on her back had faded, but the memory of their shared ordeal remained sharp as desert thorns. Nathan had settled into a quiet life teaching frontier children in Tucson, his damaged arm a daily reminder of both loss and survival. The letter from Luke arrived on a dusty afternoon, carried by a weary rider who'd crossed 3 territories to deliver it. The words transported him back to that blood-soaked dawn, and he knew he had to answer the call. The reunion in Pueblo was bittersweet. Charlotte's establishment had become a respectable hotel, far removed from her previous life. The 4 survivors gathered in her private parlor, gray threading their hair now, but their bonds forged in fire remained unbroken. Father Isaac's absence was a palpable void. He'd passed 2 winters prior, finding his faith again in his final days while ministering to displaced natives. They learned that Joshua, one of Caleb's former lieutenants, had survived and was recruiting desperate men with tales of the Apache mine's riches. The old map had spawned a dozen copies, each claiming authenticity, each leading fortune hunters to their deaths in the unforgiving mountains. The cycle of violence threatened to begin anew. Luke proposed they undertake one final journey, not to find the mine, but to bury its legend for good. Caroline's network of contacts provided intelligence about Joshua's movements. Nathan's knowledge of the territory proved invaluable in planning their approach. Charlotte liquidated some of her holdings to fund the expedition, knowing that peace was worth more than profit. They tracked Joshua's gang through the high country, past the bleached bones of failed expeditions. The mountains hadn't changed, still beautiful and merciless. At night, around low-burning fires, they shared memories of that first journey. Not just the terror and loss, but the moments of grace. Isaac's quiet wisdom, Eleanor's songs, Rose's fierce courage before the end. The confrontation came in a narrow box canyon where ancient petroglyphs told stories of older conflicts. Joshua had drawn 30 men to his cause, desperate souls seeking myths instead of honest work. But Luke and his companions had something stronger than greed. They had truth and the weight of memory. What followed wasn't a battle so much as a reckoning. Caroline's steady aim and Nathan's strategy turned the tide before blood could flow too freely. Charlotte's commanding presence and Luke's hard-earned wisdom convinced most of Joshua's men to stand down. In the end, Joshua himself fled into the maze of cliffs, taking his poisoned dreams with him. They spent 3 days destroying the false maps, sharing the real story with those who would listen. The truth of the Apache mine's guardians, the cost of their own journey, the futility of seeking fortune built on others' suffering. Some listened, some didn't, but the legend's power began to fade like footprints in wind-blown sand. Returning to Pueblo, they knew this chapter was truly closed. Caroline expanded her network of safe houses, extending help to anyone seeking a fresh start. Nathan found love late in life, marrying a widow whose quiet strength reminded him of Eleanor. Charlotte's hotel became known as a place where weary travelers could find not just rest, but redemption. Luke returned to his cabin near Durango, but not to solitude. He became a sort of informal historian, documenting the real stories of the frontier. Not the dime novel fantasies, but the complex truths of how the West was shaped by people of all colors and creeds, each carrying their own dreams and burdens. The old map remained on his wall, now accompanied by a photograph taken in Charlotte's parlor. 4 survivors, older and grayer, bound by something stronger than blood. In the end, they had found a different kind of gold. The kind that glows in shared memories, in lives touched and changed, in a legacy of truth rather than legend. They say the Apache mine still lies hidden in those mountains, its secrets kept by ancient guardians and modern ghosts. But its true treasure was never gold. It was the story of 4 broken people who found wholeness in each other, who turned a quest for vengeance into a journey of redemption. That's the kind of wealth that endures, passed down in whispered tales around frontier fires, a reminder that the richest veins in life are the ones that run through the human heart.